Okay, so now moving on to section 2, where we're going to talk a little bit about sensory processing. So survival depends on both sensation and perception. Sensation, again, is the awareness of changes in the internal and external environment. So basically, our ability to detect these changes. Perception is going to be the conscious interpretation of those stimuli, and that's going to determine how we actually respond to the sensation that we're aware of. So the somatosensory system is organized based off of where they're receiving the input. So basically, when we talk about the somatosensory system, it's part of the sensory system serving the body wall and the limbs. So it's going to receive input from all possible receptor locations, so exteroreceptors, proprioreceptors, and interoreceptors. Once these sensory receptors receive this information, then they have to send the signal toward the head. As they are sending the signal to our brain and our spinal cord, it is going to be processed. So when we talk about processing the information from the original stimulus to the point where it reaches our central nervous system, there's 3 different levels. The first level is the receptor level, so that's actually occurring at the sensory receptors themselves. The next one is going to be your circuit level, where there's processing in the ascending pathways. And then finally, it's going to reach the perceptual level, which is in our cortical sensory area, where we're able to actually process the information that was perceived at our sensory receptors to begin with. So let's talk first about the first level, which is processing at the receptor level. We have to first generate a signal. So for sensation to occur, that stimulus has to excite the sensory receptor. And once that sensory receptor is excited, we have to be able to generate an action potential that can reach our brain and our spinal cord. However, the stimulus energy must match the receptor specificity, meaning not all receptors can sense the same things. So for example, touch receptors, they can't respond to light. Also, the stimulus must be applied within a receptive field, and the receptive field is just the area of the receptor that it monitors. So only within a certain vicinity of the location of the sensory receptor can it actually be sensed. Also, when we're talking about processing at the receptor level, we have to have transduction. And transduction is basically taking that energy of the stimulus and converting it into a graded potential. Just like those graded potentials that we talked about with our neurons. So the graded potentials are very short-lived. They dissipate with distance, and they can either be depolarizing or hyperpolarizing. Depending on which receptors are generating these graded potentials, or we term the graded potentials 2 different things. So if we have the graded potentials occurring in our general sense receptors, then we call it a generator potential. If we have these graded potentials occurring in our special sense organs, so like our eye or our ear, those would be called receptor potentials. But both the generator potentials and the receptor potentials are forms of graded potentials. And once we generate these graded potentials, they have to reach that threshold, same thing that we talked about with the neuron, in order to generate an action potential. The second level of processing is adaptation. So adaptation is basically the change in sensitivity in the presence of a constant stimulus. So receptor membranes become less responsive, and receptor potentials decline in frequency or stop. So we have 2 basic types of receptors. We have phasic receptors and tonic receptors. Phasic receptors are really, really fast to adapt, and they're going to send signals both at the beginning or the end of a stimulus only. So for example, receptors for pressure, touch, or smell. Tonic receptors are a lot different, so these are going to adapt very slowly or not at all, meaning their sensitivity is not going to change. And examples of those are nociceptors and a lot of our proprioreceptors. And if you can imagine, we would not want our nociceptors to adapt to the stimulus of pain, and that's going to help us provide a protective mechanism for our body. So phasic receptors, super fast adapting. Tonic receptors, slow adapting to whatever stimulus is initiate them. So for example, pain. We would not want to adapt to pain. The final level is going to be processing at the circuit level, and we have a couple different neurons that process the information once we reach the somatosensory area. The first neuron is going to be called first order sensory neurons, and these are ones that are actually going to be conducting the impulses from the receptor itself to either a reflex, which we're not going to cover in this course, or send the information to a second order neuron and somewhere in your brain or your spinal cord. So first order neurons, they take it from the receptor and send it, for our sake in this course, to a second order sensory neuron. The whole purpose of the second order sensory neuron is to take the impulse that was brought in by the first order sensory neuron and basically just send the signal to the third order sensory neuron. And the third order sensory neurons are going to be the ones that actually conduct the impulses from the thalamus to the somatosensory cortex, where we can actually process the information. So that would be the perceptual level. So once we get to the perceptual level, we have a couple different ways and aspects of our sensory that we are perceiving. So when we talk about perceptual level, we're talking about the interpretation of the sensory input, and that's going to depend on the specific location of the target neurons in the sensory cortex itself. So I would definitely be aware of these different definitions as far as aspects of sensory perception. So for example, if we're talking about perceptual detection, that's the ability of us to detect a stimulus, and in order for us to detect a stimulus, that means we're going to summate all of the impulses that we had originating at the receptor. So this is really just the simplest level of perception. The next one is magnitude estimation. And in order to identify the magnitude of the stimulus that we're sensing at a receptor, we're going to be able to detect that based off of the frequency. So intensity, coded, and frequency of impulses. The higher the frequency means that we have a higher intensity or a higher magnitude. A lower frequency of impulses means that we would have a lower intensity of magnitude. Spatial discrimination is another one, and that's going to be identifying site or pattern of stimulus. A lot of times this is studied by a 2-point discrimination test, and basically a 2-point discrimination test is your ability to determine how close 2 points on the skin can be while still being perceived as 2 points instead of one. So for example, if you weren't looking and somebody was touching you on your back in 2 different places, that you can perceive that you're being touched on your back in 2 different places. The closer those points get together, you may only be able to detect there's only 1 point or somebody touching you at one place. Because those are so close together, there's 2 points. So that's the 2-point discrimination. We also have feature abstraction. So this is the identification of more complex aspects and several stimulus properties. So for example, touch involves several complex aspects. When you're touching something that has different textures, so for your textbook uses the example of velvet. So velvet is really smooth, it's compressible, it's also not continuous if you run your fingers along it. So there's a lot of aspects to touch. So there's a lot of feature abstraction when we're talking about that. The next one's quality discrimination. So the ability to identify some modalities of sensation. So for example, taste is a really good example for us to distinguish between something tasting sweet or sour or salty or bitter or something like that. The last one is going to be pattern of recognition. So the recognition of familiar or significant patterns in stimuli. So for example, a lot of us are able to recognize the melody in a piece of music and recognize that we have heard that before. I don't go too much into the perception of pain. So if you actually are reading this section in your textbook, only really worry about this slide at all. So when we're talking about pain, it's really important when we perceive pain, which is why our nociceptors do not adapt to the stimulus of pain. And that's because it's actually warning us that we have some sort of damage. So it's acting as a protective mechanism. A lot of things that can cause pain. One would be something like extreme pressure, extreme temperature, like if we talked outside of that range of 50 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, anything outside that range we would actually detect as pain. A lot of chemicals can also cause pain, so things like histamine, potassium, ATP, acids, and bradykinin. And we also have impulses that travel on the fibers, and they're going to cause release of neurotransmitters like glutamate and something called substance P. And both of these are able to activate second order sensory neurons to indicate that we have some sort of pain going on. Some pain impulses, though, they can be blocked by inhibitory endogenous opioids, so something that we produce itself. That's what endogenous means, so endorphins. If our body is producing a lot of endorphins, that can go and block the response or perception of pain. So basically our own pain suppressing system that we have in the event that we need it.